People who are treated poorly do worse than people who are not. School systems should teach more about tolerance in a new class to teach their students about being more tolerant towards others. I will be talking about how discrimination affects people. Second, I will be talking about how it should be taught more in schools. And finally, about how having anti-racist policies are helpful. Now I will begin by talking about the story I read. The story The Wretched and the Beautiful by E. Lily Yu is about humans making first contact with aliens and how people mistreated the good aliens because they didn't like how they looked. School systems should teach more about tolerance in a new class to teach students more in depth about how to be more tolerant of others. Quote, that the countries in their interregional coalition would resettle a quota of the aliens in inverse proportion to national wealth, end quote. This quote shows how little tolerance the people had for the aliens they knew almost nothing about and how they separated them. Quote, the couple of countries still recovering from Russian depredations were assigned 6 aliens each, while the countries of high fashion and cold beer received 2 or 3, end quote. This scene shows how more of the aliens were given to the poorer countries who couldn't exactly say no to these new rules. Quote, this was appalling news. We who had stitched, skimped, and pinched all year for one luxurious day on a clean beach would have our wallets rifled to feed and house the very creatures whose presence denied us a section of our beach and the vistas we had paid for. End quote. This scene reveals that the people were more concerned about having to share their beach with aliens than to actually help them with what they needed. Now to move on to some topics from the real world. People who are treated differently experience issues. Quote, results from a number of studies have linked experiences of discrimination and perceived racism to a range of psychosocial difficulties in African American youth, including low self-esteem and depressive systems, end quote. This quote from the National Library of Medicine states this. It shows people how in the real world people are affected by this type of behavior. A large body of literature has linked perceived racial discrimination to deleterious psychological outcomes in African American adults, end quote. This is another quote from the National Library of Medicine, and it shows that discrimination really does have an effect on others. Teaching students to be more tolerant of others helps children thrive and be more successful. Quote, don't expect to have the talk about discrimination. It shouldn't be one conversation. Rather, let the conversation be open and ongoing, end quote. According to the American Psychological Association, they are basically saying that children should have constant conversations about this to better understand this issue. Quote, older students can engage in deeper conversations about the historical and systematic reasons differences in treatment based on skin tone exist. Giving them a strong sense of how race and ethnicity have shaped their own lives reduces anxiety about interacting across differences. End quote. This quote from Harvard's website shows that students can and should still learn about this, even when they're older. Anti-racist policies in schools helps kids realize that it is wrong to discriminate against people. Quote, promote community education and dialogue about racism, its causes and effects, through a variety of channels, end quote. This quote from the anti-racism policy, which is used in schools today, shows that this is helpful in helping children realize that discrimination is wrong. Quote, the setting of initial priorities should go hand in hand with professional development for senior leadership teams as well as teaching staff, end quote. This quote from the Council of Europe shows that having priorities on anti-discrimination policies go hand in hand with development for leaders as well as teachers. To move on to an opposing view. Someone could argue that teaching about discrimination could be excessive or not necessary. Quote, when people are discriminated against, we can miss an important opportunity to learn from them, end quote. Not teaching about discrimination leads to discrimination, and when that happens, we miss an opportunity for someone to succeed, and it can lead to bad outcomes, according to the American Psychological Association. This claim is more valid because people are in today's world are still discriminated against, and we need others to not allow it to happen. My final statements. The author's main idea of her story was that discrimination is bad and that we shouldn't judge someone based on how they look. My main points were that discrimination is bad and that schools should try to prevent it by teaching about it more. In real life, there are already some policies that have taken into place at schools and around the world. This is pretty much agreeing to what the author stated and is a step in the right direction. In short, we should have a class that goes throughout all of school that simply discusses these issues in depth so we can tackle the issues of discrimination.